A fragment of parchment no larger than an open hand sits inside a climate-controlled case at the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. The Aramaic letters on its surface are pressed into animal skin that was dried and scraped sometime around 150 BCE. The fragment is catalogued as the fourth quarter of 24. It has been examined by fewer than a dozen scholars in the last 70 years. What it describes is not a prayer. It is not a hymn. It is a procedural account of what happens to the human soul in the 72 hours immediately following death. The steps are numbered. The directions are cardinal. The entities involved are named, and the Western Church has never preached a word of it. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Church leaders banned it, buried it, and called it dangerous. For 17 centuries it stayed that way. Then, in 1947, the caves at Qumran gave it back. 11 separate copies of Enoch surfaced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than numbers. More than most books that stayed in the Bible you were handed at confirmation. The scholars who translated the oldest fragments found something that has never made it into a Sunday sermon. Enoch does not describe death as an ending. He describes it as a departure. A structured, directional, procedural departure with specific checkpoints, specific guides, and specific consequences depending on what the soul carries with it when it leaves. If what was removed from Scripture matters to you, stay with this, because in the next several minutes, you will see exactly what Enoch records about the moment of death, what the soul encounters in the first 3 days, and why the Church found this account too precise to allow into the hands of ordinary believers. What makes this stranger than it should be is the location of the primary account. It does not come from the section of Enoch that scholars typically discuss: the Watchers, the Giants, the Flood Judgment. Those sections get the attention. The death protocol is buried in a passage that most English editions either compress into 2 sentences or omit entirely. It appears across chapters 102 through 104 of the complete Javes manuscript tradition preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Aksum, and in fragments from the Qumran caves that the original publication team assigned to the lowest research priority. The fragments sat untouched for decades after their discovery. When they were finally examined and compared to the Ethiopian manuscripts, scholars found that the Western editions of Enoch had collapsed an 18-step sequential account into a vague reference to the soul going to a place of rest. 18 steps became 1 sentence. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 commentary on First Enoch, published by Fortress Press, remains the definitive scholarly reference in English. Noted in a section most readers overlook that chapters 102 through 104 contain operational language not found anywhere else in the Enochic corpus. He used the word operational deliberately, not symbolic, not poetic, operational. The language of process, of sequence, of a mechanism with moving parts. Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, whose work on the Aramaic Enoch tradition has become the standard reference for fragment analysis, identified in a 2017 paper that the Qumran fragments touching on post-death movement show consistent directionality across multiple scribal traditions, multiple communities, multiple copyists, multiple centuries, all preserving the same directional framework. The soul after death does not drift. It moves. It moves in a specific direction, through a specific sequence, guided by a specific being, and what it encounters at each stage is determined by what it carried out of its body at the moment of separation. This is the detail that changed everything when the Ethiopian manuscripts were compared directly to the Qumran fragments. This is what the Church found too precise to include. Here is what the text actually says. Enoch describes being taken to the threshold of death, not through it, but to its edge, close enough to observe the process the way a person standing at the door of a room can see what happens inside without entering. The angel who brings him there is Raphael, not as a symbolic figure. Raphael is named throughout the death sequence with the same specificity that a medical chart names an attending physician. He is present. He is working. He is doing something that requires both presence and expertise. The first thing Enoch records is the separation itself. The Ge'ez text uses a word that Ethiopian monks also use to describe the pulling of a thread from cloth. Not a tearing, not a violent removal, a careful, deliberate drawing. Out, the soul does not explode from the body. It is drawn. The distinction in the original language is precise. Whatever Enoch witnessed at the threshold, he came away with the impression that the separation of soul from body is a skilled act, not a mechanical one. Someone is doing it, someone who knows how. The moment of separation is followed immediately by orientation. This is the detail that no popular account of Enoch's death passages ever includes, because most popular accounts are working from compressed Western translations that have already removed it. The Ge'ez manuscript describes a period of stillness lasting what the text calls 3 measures of the celestial watch. The exact duration this translates to in earthly time has been debated by Ethiopian scholars for centuries. The Mashafa Burhan, a secondary Ethiopian theological text that references Enoch's death sequence, uses this same phrase and glosses it as the period during which a soul learns where it is, not where it is going. Where it is, the soul, freshly drawn from the body, requires a period of reorientation before it can move. Enoch records this as fact, not as poetry. The stillness is not rest, it is calibration. And this is where it gets disturbing. After the period of stillness, the text describes the soul's first movement, not upward, not downward. The Ge'ez is explicit. The first movement is lateral, and it is guided, Raphael, or in some fragments a being whose name translates from Aramaic as the one who carries the account, moves alongside the soul, not ahead of it, not behind it. Alongside, Enoch writes this with the same matter. Of, fact tone he uses to describe geographical terrain. There is a guide. The guide has a position relative to the soul. The position is deliberate. The soul does not wander. It is accompanied. What the guide carries is the detail that stopped Western translators in their tracks. Fragment the 4th quarter of 24, The Peace and the Climate, Controlled Case in Jerusalem, contains 6 lines describing what Enoch calls the record of breath. The Aramaic phrase is related to the same root word that appears in the creation account. The breath that was breathed into Adam, but here it is not a gift being given. It is a document being carried. The guide alongside the soul carries what Enoch describes as a record of every moment in which the soul's breath was used in service of another, and every moment in which it was used to diminish another, not sins in the abstract, not moral categories, breath. Every word spoken, every sound made, every exhalation directed toward or against another living being. The record is specific to the point of being granular. Enoch does not say a record of good and evil. He says a record of breath. The implications of that distinction are significant enough that Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in a private correspondence later, archived at the University of Manchester, that the breath record passage was the single most difficult section to render in English. Not because of linguistic complexity, but because of theological consequences. The record Enoch describes has no category in Western Christian thought. It is not a list of sins. It is not a judgment of intentions. It is a complete phonetic and respiratory archive of a human life. Rendered in a medium the text describes as neither light nor dark, but something the Ge'ez word suggests is closer to weight. The record has mass. The guide carries something that has weight, and the weight of it determines what happens next. Here is what the translators left out. The standard English editions of Enoch that most readers encounter compress the next section into a single verse about the righteous being comforted and the wicked being condemned. The Ge'ez manuscript in Aksum contains what those editions omit, a 7-stage description of what Enoch calls the passage through the gates of accounting. Not one gate. 7. Each one corresponds to a category of what the breath record contains. Each one is presided over by a different being. Each one requires the soul to stop, to be examined, and to proceed or to be held. The first gate, Enoch writes, is the gate of spoken harm. Every word that diminished another soul is reviewed here, not the intention behind the word itself, its effect on the person who received it. Enoch records that at this gate the soul hears, for what may be the first time, what its words sounded like from the outside, not what it meant to say, what was heard. The being at this gate does not judge, it plays back. The judgment comes from the soul's own recognition of the gap between intention and impact. This is not purgatory in the Catholic sense. There is no purification through suffering at the gate. The text describes something closer to a comprehensive audit, conducted in the presence of the record itself. The soul is not being punished for what it said. It is being shown what it said and given, for the first time, the full sensory experience of having received it. Enoch writes that some souls pass through the first gate quickly. Others remain for what the text describes as a duration proportional to the weight of what is reviewed. The weight again, the same word, what the guide was carrying has not been set down. It is still present, its mass still matters. The part that should not be possible is what follows in the third gate. Enoch calls it the gate of withheld breath. The Aramaic fragment corresponding to this section uses a construction that appears nowhere else in the Qumran literature, except in one legal document describing a breach of fiduciary duty. The gate of withheld breath is not for words spoken harmfully. It is for words that were never spoken, comfort that was available and not given, warning that was possible and not delivered, truth that was known and not shared with someone who needed it. Enoch records that this gate holds more souls in extended review than any of the others, not because people are more guilty of silence than of speech, but because silence leaves no memory. The soul that spent a lifetime withholding does not remember the withholding. It remembers the reasons. The gate of withheld breath removes the reasons and shows only the absence, what was not said to whom, and what that absence cost them. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living authorities on Enoch scholarship, applied for direct access to the Aksum manuscripts in 1988 to examine this specific passage in its original J's context. He was denied. He applied again in 1997, denied again. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, Vanderkam stated that the gate sequence in the death passage is, in his assessment, the most structurally complete account of postmortem moral review in all of Second Temple Jewish literature, and that the inaccessibility of the primary manuscripts has prevented the scholarly community from fully understanding what the tradition actually preserves. The manuscripts remain inaccessible. Vanderkam has not been granted access. The Ethiopian government classified church archives as national cultural property after the revolution of 1974, and no external researcher has been allowed near the relevant sections since. Now here is where it gets active. In 2014, Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU Langone Medical Center published results in the journal Resuscitation from what became the largest study of cardiac arrest survivors ever conducted. The AWARE study, which tracked 2060 cardiac arrest events across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom, United States, and Austria, documented consistent patterns in the experiences reported by patients who were resuscitated after periods of clinical death, defined as the complete cessation of heartbeat, respiration, and measurable brain activity. Among the verified accounts, Parnia's team identified a recurring structural feature that no prior theory of near-death experience had predicted. Patients did not report encountering a judgment figure who evaluated them from outside. They reported consistently and independently across different countries and different religious backgrounds, an experience of self-review in which they perceived events from their own lives from the perspective of the other people involved, not their own memory of the event, the sensory experience of the other person receiving the impact of what they had done. The woman in cardiac arrest in Brighton, who had been cold to her mother for years, described experiencing what it felt like to be her mother receiving that coldness. In real time, with full sensory detail, the man who had lied to his business partner described experiencing his partner's discovery of the lie from inside his partner's body. Parnia was careful in his published language. He did not claim these experiences were evidence of an afterlife. He claimed they were real neurological events that were occurring in patients with no measurable brain activity, which created a separate set of scientific problems entirely. But the structural description his patients provided, a review of the impact of one's life on others, conducted from the perspective of those others, experienced sequentially, with duration proportional to the weight of each event reviewed, matches the gate sequence in Enoch's death passage with a precision that is not easy to explain. Enoch wrote this account approximately 200 BCE. Parnia's patients reported it in hospitals across 3 countries in the 21st century. Neither group had access to the other's account. The Ge'ez manuscripts were inaccessible since 1974. The Western translations had removed the gate sequence entirely. Parnia's patients were not reading fragments from Qumran before their cardiac events, and yet the structure they described, first, person's sensory experience of the impact of one's words and silences on others, conducted in sequential stages, with a guide present, alongside a record being carried, matches what the 4th quarter of 24 describes in Aramaic that has not been publicly available in its complete form since the 1st century BCE. In 2022, a follow-up study from Parnia's team published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences expanded the dataset and confirmed the pattern. Patients with the most extended periods of clinical death reported the most complete review sequences. The longest accounts described something none of the researchers had language for: a period of stillness before the review began, a calibration phase. One patient called it, though she had no framework for that word in a post-death context. She said it felt like the time between waking and knowing where you were. Enoch calls this same phase the period of 3 celestial watches during which the soul learns where it is. The patient in Parnia's study had no access to Enoch. She was a retired school teacher from Ohio who described herself as a non-practicing Methodist, a period of stillness, a guide alongside a record being carried, a sequential review of the impact of breath on other lives. Gates that could not be rushed, duration proportional to what was reviewed. The suppression begins, as it always does. At the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, the council minutes do not name the death passage specifically, but Canon 60 of that council prohibits books that describe what the council called reserved matters, things concerning the structure of judgment that belong to God alone to reveal. The gate sequence in Enoch's death passage is precisely that, a structural account of how judgment operates, not who judges, how the mechanism works, what the steps are, what each gate examines, how long each review takes. The council did not say Enoch was lying. The council said the information was not for ordinary believers. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, excluded Enoch and wrote in his preface that it contained descriptions of the passage of souls that were too detailed for Christian teaching. Too detailed, not false. Too detailed. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 415 CE, argued that structured accounts of what happens after death gave people the wrong relationship to moral life. If a person knows exactly what is reviewed and how, Augustine wrote, they will calculate rather than repent. He was not making a theological argument about Enoch's accuracy. He was making an institutional argument about Enoch's utility. A structured afterlife review with specific gates and specific categories of examination is not useful to an institution that positions itself as the mediating authority between the living and their eternal fate. A mechanism that operates without institutional mediation, that examines the soul directly, that plays back the impact of withheld breath regardless of whether the person ever confessed it, leaves the church with nothing to sell and no toll booth to staff. Jerome, read the gate sequence. Augustine read it. Neither called it false. Both called it dangerous. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating outside Rome's reach, kept the complete Enoch in its canon. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts to Europe in 1773, scholars who examined the death passage in Edinburgh called it, in an 1821 review published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the most complete thanatological document in any pre-Christian literature. Thanatological, the science of death. They were not reading it as theology. They were reading it as documentation. R. Charles, producing the standard English translation in 1906, encountered the gate sequence in the Ethiopian manuscripts, and made a choice that has shaped every popular understanding of Enoch since. He compressed the 7 gates into a footnote and described the passage as a late addition influenced by Persian sources. His reasoning: no ancient Judean writer could have produced a text this structurally specific about post-mortem experience without borrowing it from somewhere else. He offered Zoroastrianism as the likely donor tradition. He provided no textual evidence for the borrowing. He offered it as an assumption dressed as a scholarly judgment, and it stuck. The problem with Charles's assumption is fragment the 4th quarter of 24, which was found in 1947 and dates to approximately 100 BCE, 2 centuries, before any proposed Persian influence could have reached the Judean scribal tradition in the form Charles described. The fragment contains elements of the gate sequence in Aramaic, in a handwriting style consistent with other Qumran material from the same period, with no linguistic markers of foreign borrowing. It is not a Persian import, it is a Judean original, and it sat unpublished for decades after its discovery, because the scholars managing the Dead Sea Scroll publication project placed cosmological and post-mortem fragments in the lowest publication priority category. The Enoch fragments describing the death passage waited over 30 years after discovery before reaching publication. Now let me be clear about what is and is not being said here. The Book of Enoch is a text that passed through centuries of transmission and translation before reaching the manuscripts that exist today. What a Second Temple Jewish writer experienced or understood, and what an Ethiopian monk copied 1,500 years later, carries distances that cannot be fully measured. The gate sequence may have accumulated interpretive layers over centuries of scribal transmission. The NDE accounts documented by Parnia's team are neurological events, and what those events mean about consciousness, death, and what lies beyond them remains genuinely contested among scientists and philosophers. These are real uncertainties, and they deserve honest acknowledgement. But here is what does not have an easy explanation. A text written before the Roman Empire describes the period immediately following death as a structured, sequential, guided process involving a record of the impact of one's words and silences on other people. Reviewed from the perspective of those people, in sequential stages, with duration proportional to what is examined, presided over by specific beings, accompanied by a guide carrying a record that has weight. The same text was removed from Scripture in 364 CE by councils, who called it too precise rather than untrue. The same text's most specific passages were compressed or omitted by every major Western translator who encountered them. The same text's primary manuscripts have been inaccessible to outside scholars since 1974. And in 2014, a team of medical researchers at NYU Langone, studying the largest dataset of cardiac arrest survivors ever assembled, documented independent accounts from patients on 3 continents describing the same structural sequence: calibration, a guide, a record, a review of impact experienced from the other side, gates proportional to duration, all of it occurring during periods when measurable brain activity had ceased. Enoch had no stethoscope. He had no clinical dataset. He had no access to the testimony of resuscitated cardiac patients from Ohio and Brighton and Vienna. He had no way to know that the specific feature of his death account that Western translators found most embarrassing, the 7-gate review of breath's impact on other lives experienced from the perspective of those other lives, would turn out to be the most consistently reported structural feature in the largest scientific study of what happens at the edge of death ever conducted. And yet the account sits there, in Aramaic on parchment older than the New Testament, in Ge'ez on manuscript pages behind church walls in Aksum, in fragments under glass in Jerusalem, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. The guide is present. The record has weight. The gates cannot be rushed. And what is reviewed is not what you intended. It is what was received. Every word you ever spoke to another living person. Every word you had the capacity to speak and chose not to. The calibration phase ends. The first gate opens. What is in your record is already determined. The question the church found too dangerous to let ordinary people sit with is the same question the fragment in Jerusalem has been asking in silence for 2,000 years. Not whether the gate sequence is real, but whether you would live differently if you knew exactly what was being carried alongside you, exactly what would be reviewed, exactly what the person on the other side of every word you ever spoke actually felt when they received it. Jerome called it too detailed. Augustine called it incompatible. Neither called it wrong. The manuscripts remain in Aksum, behind walls that scholars cannot pass. The fragments remain in Jerusalem, in cases that researchers cannot open. The cardiac arrest accounts are in Peer, reviewed journals that anyone can download. And in a text the church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands at the threshold of death, shown the mechanism by an angel, watching the guide take position alongside the departing soul, watching the weight of the record settle, watching the first gate begin to open. The process has been running without interruption since before the canon was closed. Your record is already being written.